In 1983, Ray Dalio called his father and asked to borrow $4,000 because Bridgewater Associates was about to collapse. 42 years later, that same company manages $150 billion. Here's exactly what happened between that phone call and becoming the world's largest hedge fund. Late 1983. Ray Dalio's office in Westport, Connecticut. The office isn't what it used to be. A year ago, this place was buzzing with analysts, phones ringing, clients calling with new money. Now it's quiet, too quiet. Ray's sitting at his desk staring at the checkbook. He does the math again, hoping somehow the numbers will be different this time. They're not. Payroll is due in 2 weeks. He doesn't have it. The consulting contracts have dried up. The last major client left 3 months ago. There's enough money to keep the lights on for maybe another month. Maybe. He picks up the phone. His hand hesitates over the numbers. This is the call you never want to make when you're 34 years old and you started your own company 8 years ago telling everyone you were going to change the world. This is the call that means you were wrong about everything. He dials his father. The conversation is short. $4,000. That's what he needs to keep Bridgewater alive a little longer. His father, a jazz musician who never had much money himself, says yes. Ray hangs up the phone. He leans back in his chair and stares at the ceiling. Just 18 months ago, he was on national television telling everyone the United States was about to enter a massive depression. He was so certain. He'd studied every debt crisis going back 100 years. The pattern was absolutely clear. Mexico defaults, contagion spreads, credit freezes, depression follows. He'd seen it before in the history books. It was obvious, except he was completely wrong. The market rallied, the economy boomed, and everyone who'd listened to him lost a fortune by pulling out that $4,000 loan. That wasn't just money to make payroll. That was the moment Ray Dalio realized that being smart wasn't enough. Being well-researched wasn't enough. Even being right about Mexico's peso crisis wasn't enough. He needed something completely different. He needed a system that would prevent him from ever being this catastrophically overconfident again. Okay, so I need to tell you about Ray Dalio's $4,000 loan from his father because this story completely changed how I think about failure, and I mean that. I've read probably every major interview Ray's ever given. I've gone through his 2017 Principles book multiple times. I've tracked down old Bridgewater documents from the 1980s and this moment. This specific moment when he had to call his dad and ask for money. This is where everything that makes Bridgewater what it is today actually begins. But here's what's wild. Most people know Ray Dalio as the guy who predicted the 2008 financial crisis. The guy who built the world's biggest hedge fund. The guy who wrote the best-selling book about systematic decision-making. What most people don't know is that Ray was weeks away from total bankruptcy in 1983. Like completely done, finished, lights out. So let me take you back to August 1982 because that's where this whole disaster starts. Ray Dalio is 33 years old. Bridgewater Associates has been around for 7 years at this point. The company's doing well, not amazing, but solid. He's got consulting clients, he's managing some money, he's built a small team. And Ray has been watching something that nobody else seems to be paying attention to. Mexico's debt situation is spiraling out of control. Now I spent a few days reading the economic data from 1982 because I wanted to understand exactly what Ray was seeing. Mexico had borrowed heavily throughout the 1970s when oil prices were high. But by 1982, oil prices were falling, interest rates in the United States were at historic highs. We're talking Paul Volcker raising rates to nearly 20% to crush inflation, and Mexico couldn't service its debt anymore. Ray sees this coming. He's been tracking it for months, and on August 12, 1982, Mexico announces it can't pay its debt. The peso collapses. Ray was right, totally, completely right. His clients who'd listened to him made money. His reputation soared. People started calling him for advice. This is the moment when Ray Dalio becomes convinced he's figured out the system. Here's where it gets interesting. Ray doesn't just stop at being right about Mexico. He takes that success and extrapolates it into a much bigger prediction. He goes on the news, and I found footage of this. It's surreal watching it now, and he tells everyone that the United States is about to enter a depression, not a recession. A depression, like 1929 levels of economic collapse. His reasoning makes sense when you hear it. Mexico defaults, that triggers defaults across Latin America. American banks have massive exposure to those loans, credit freezes up, the economy contracts, depression follows. He'd studied the debt crises of the 1800s and 1900s. The pattern seemed obvious. It had happened before. Historical precedent was clear. And so Ray goes all in on this prediction. He's not hedging. He's not saying maybe or possibly. He's saying this is absolutely going to happen. He tells his clients to pull their money out of stocks. Some of them listen. He positions his own investments for a major economic collapse. Then something unexpected happens. The market rallies. The Federal Reserve cuts rates. The economy doesn't collapse. It starts one of the longest bull markets in American history. Ray Dalio was spectacularly, career-endingly wrong. Now think about what this means for a second. You're 33 years old. You just made the biggest, most public prediction of your career. You went on television. You told your clients to pull their money out. Some of them actually listened to you and lost out on massive gains. Your reputation, which was built on being right about Mexico, is now completely destroyed. The clients leave, not slowly, fast. Within months, Ray goes from managing multiple accounts to barely having any clients at all. The consulting contracts dry up. The phone stops ringing. People who used to call him for advice won't return his calls. I found an interview where Ray talks about this period, and he says something that really stuck with me. He said, "I had been so sure, I had done the research, I had historical precedent, and I was wrong, not a little wrong, catastrophically wrong." By late 1982, early 1983, Bridgewater is in serious trouble. The team that Ray had built, analysts, researchers, support staff, he has to let most of them go. The office that used to be full of people working on deals is now almost empty. At one point, it's basically just Ray and a couple of other people trying to keep the lights on. And this is where the $4,000 loan comes in. It's 1983. Ray needs to make payroll. He doesn't have the money. Bridgewater Associates, the company he'd started in 1975 from his two-bedroom apartment with $300, the company he'd spent 8 years building, is about to collapse. He calls his father. His dad was a jazz musician, not wealthy, not someone with a ton of extra cash sitting around. But he loans Ray $4,000. In 2025 dollars, that's probably worth about $12,000. Not a massive amount, but enough to keep things going a little longer. Now here's what I want you to understand about this moment, because this is where Ray's entire philosophy gets built. Most people, when they fail like this, they do one of two things. Either they blame external factors, the market was irrational, I was unlucky, nobody could have seen this coming, or they just give up entirely because the pain is too much. Ray does neither of those things. Instead, he does something that seems completely insane when you're at rock bottom. He starts systematically analyzing what went wrong, not to make himself feel better, not to find excuses, to actually figure out where his thinking broke down. He writes down everything. What did he believe? Why did he believe it? What data was he looking at? Where did his reasoning fail? What did he miss? He treats his failure like a case study, like he's examining someone else's mistake instead of his own. And what he discovers fundamentally changes everything. The problem wasn't that he didn't work hard enough. He worked incredibly hard. The problem wasn't that he didn't do research. He'd done mountains of research. The problem was that he was overconfident. He found a pattern that worked once, the Mexico call, and he assumed that same pattern would work for the much more complex question of whether the entire American economy would collapse. In his Principles book, Ray describes this realization. He says he learned that the biggest threat to good decision-making wasn't lack of information. It was the arrogance of thinking you know more than you actually do. It was confusing a good call with having figured out the system. So Ray starts building something different. He begins developing what would eventually become Bridgewater's systematic approach to investing. Instead of relying on his gut or his conviction, he starts creating rules, decision-making frameworks, ways to test his beliefs against historical data without fooling himself. This is where the concept of radical truth and radical transparency comes from. Ray realizes that he was so convinced he was right about the depression call that he didn't seek out people who disagreed with him. He surrounded himself with his own certainty. So he creates a culture at Bridgewater where people are required to challenge each other, where being wrong isn't shameful, it's just data, where the goal isn't to be right, it's to find the truth. He develops what he later calls believability weighting. Not everyone's opinion should count the same. If someone has a track record of being right about economic predictions, their view should carry more weight than someone who doesn't. But, and this is critical, even the most believable person can be wrong, so you still need systematic ways to test ideas. Ray also starts building diversification into everything. He made a huge concentrated bet that the economy would collapse. When that bet failed, it nearly destroyed him. So he begins developing the concept that would eventually become the all-weather portfolio. Instead of making big concentrated bets, spread your risk across multiple uncorrelated strategies. Make 15 or more independent bets so that no single mistake can kill you. But here's the thing that I think is most important about this story. The $4,000 loan wasn't just about surviving. It was about buying time to transform how he thought about everything. Ray could have taken that money, kept Bridgewater alive for a few more months, tried to rebuild his client base doing the same kind of work he'd always done. He didn't do that. Instead, he used that time to completely rebuild his investment philosophy from the ground up, to create systems that would prevent him from ever being that overconfident again, to develop processes for testing ideas rigorously before betting on them, to build a culture where admitting mistakes was valued more than protecting your ego. I found a speech Ray gave decades later where someone asked him about the 1982 mistake, and he said something that blew my mind. He said that failure was the best thing that ever happened to me, not because failure feels good, it doesn't, but because it forced me to be radically open-minded and to build systems instead of relying on my judgment. Think about that. The thing that almost destroyed him became the foundation for building a $150 billion hedge fund, not in spite of the failure, but because of it. Now let's fast forward. It's 1985-1986. Ray has rebuilt Bridgewater using these new systematic principles. He's not making big public predictions anymore. He's not going on television saying the world is going to end. Instead, he's quietly building diversified strategies, testing everything against historical data, creating decision-making processes that don't rely on any single person being right. The consulting business comes back, slowly at first, then faster. Clients start trusting him again, but this time it's different. He's not selling them on his conviction. He's showing them systematic approaches to managing risk. He's demonstrating that the goal isn't to predict the future, it's to build portfolios that can handle multiple different futures. By 1991, Ray launches Pure Alpha, Bridgewater's flagship fund. It's built entirely on the lessons from the 1982 disaster. Diversified strategies, systematic analysis, no huge concentrated bets, risk management built into everything. And it works. Pure Alpha goes on to average about 12% returns per year for decades. Then comes 2008, the financial crisis that everyone else missed, but Ray's team at Bridgewater sees it coming. Not because Ray is smarter than everyone else this time, but because the systematic processes they'd built, processes that were born from the 1982 failure, those processes identified the housing bubble, the over-leveraged banks, the unsustainable debt levels. And here's what's wild. In 2008, when the S&P 500 crashes by 37%, Pure Alpha returns positive 14%. Bridgewater becomes legendary. The story everyone tells is that Ray Dalio predicted the crisis. But the real story is that the systems he built after nearly going bankrupt in 1983, those systems predicted the crisis. I want you to really sit with this for a minute because it completely changed how I think about my own failures. Ray Dalio didn't become successful by avoiding mistakes. He became successful by creating a framework for learning from mistakes faster and more systematically than anyone else. There's a formula he talks about in his Principles book. Pain plus reflection equals progress. Most people experience the pain of failure and either ignore it or let it paralyze them. Ray systematized the reflection part. He turned failure into a decision-making laboratory. When Bridgewater makes a mistake now and they still make mistakes, that's not the point. They have a whole process for analyzing what went wrong. They call them issue logs. Every time something doesn't go as expected, it gets written down. What happened? What did we believe? What actually occurred? What does this tell us about our thinking? How do we update our understanding? This all traces back to that $4,000 loan, to Ray sitting in an empty office realizing that his confidence had nearly destroyed everything he'd built, to the decision to use that failure as the foundation for something completely different. Now here's where this gets really practical for your life. You don't need to be running a hedge fund to apply this. The principle is universal. When something goes wrong, and I mean really wrong, not just a minor setback, you have a choice. You can blame circumstances, make excuses, or try to forget it happened. Or you can do what Ray did. Write it down. What did you believe would happen? Why did you believe it? What actually happened? Where was your thinking wrong? Not to beat yourself up, not to prove you're a failure, but to actually learn something systematic from the experience. Ray talks about this idea of getting above yourself and looking down at your situation like you're someone else examining your decisions. It's hard to do. When you're in the middle of failure, when you've just had to borrow money from your father because your company is collapsing, the natural instinct is to either panic or rationalize. Ray forced himself to do neither. He analyzed. And the crazy thing, that discipline, that ability to treat your own failures as learning opportunities instead of catastrophes, that's what separates people who grow from people who stay stuck. It's not talent, it's not intelligence, it's not even hard work. It's the systematic process of converting painful experiences into better decision-making frameworks. Let me give you another angle on this because I think it matters. After Ray rebuilt Bridgewater in the mid to late 1980s, he could have played it safe. He'd learned his lesson about overconfidence. He could have just run a solid consulting business, made a comfortable living, never taken big risks again. He didn't do that either. Instead, he used the lessons from failure to take better risks. That's the nuance everyone misses. The lesson wasn't never make predictions or never have conviction. The lesson was build systems that prevent your confidence from exceeding your actual knowledge. There's a massive difference. Bridgewater went on to make plenty of bold calls. They positioned for the European debt crisis in 2010. They warned about China's debt levels years before it became a mainstream concern. But those calls weren't based on Ray's gut feeling or pattern recognition from a single previous experience. They were based on systematic analysis, stress-tested against historical data, diversified across multiple strategies. That's what the $4,000 loan bought, not survival, transformation, a complete rethinking of what it means to make good decisions under uncertainty. I'll tell you what really gets me about this story. It's not that Ray went from nearly bankrupt to building a $150 billion firm. That's impressive, sure, but what actually matters is that he created a replicable system. The principles he developed aren't secret. He literally published them in a book that anyone can read. The all-weather portfolio allocation is publicly known. The idea of pain plus reflection equals progress, that's right there for anyone to use. The barrier isn't access to the information. The barrier is being willing to do what Ray did when he was 34 years old and borrowing money from his father. Being willing to look at your failures honestly. Being willing to systematize the learning process instead of just moving on. Being willing to build processes that protect you from your own overconfidence. Most people fail and then just try harder next time. Ray failed and built a system that would make him smarter. That's the difference. That's what that $4,000 actually paid for. Let me bring this forward to 2025 because this isn't just historical. Ray's in his mid-70s now. He's not running Bridgewater day-to-day anymore. But the systems he built after that 1982 disaster, they're still running. Pure Alpha is still using the same diversification principles. The culture of radical truth and radical transparency, where people are expected to challenge each other and admit mistakes, that's still how Bridgewater operates. And here's what I find fascinating. In 2022, Ray made another big prediction about inflation. He was early, the timing was off, some people said he was wrong, and you know what Ray did? He acknowledged it publicly. He said, "I was early on this call, here's what I was seeing, here's what I missed about the timing." No defensiveness, no excuses, just systematic reflection on what happened. That's the legacy of the $4,000 loan, not that Ray became perfect at predictions, but that he built a framework for handling being wrong that actually makes him more right over time. So here's what I want you to take away from this. Ray Dalio didn't build the world's largest hedge fund by being smarter than everyone else. He built it by being more systematic about learning from failure than anyone else. That 1982 depression call that nearly bankrupted him wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning, because he took that catastrophic failure and turned it into the decision-making framework that's worked through every crisis since then. The $4,000 from his father wasn't just a loan, it was time. Time to sit with the wreckage of his biggest mistake and figure out how to make sure it never happened again. Time to build systems instead of relying on confidence. Time to develop processes that would protect him from his own blind spots. And that's available to you right now, not the money, the approach. The next time something goes wrong, really wrong, you can do what most people do. Move on fast, try to forget, focus on the next thing. Or you can do what Ray did, sit with it, analyze it systematically. Build a process that makes you smarter because of the failure, not just in spite of it. Pain plus reflection equals progress. It's not a cute saying. It's a systematic approach to decision-making that Ray Dalio proved works at the highest levels of finance. And it all started with a phone call to his father asking for $4,000 because everything else had fallen apart. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment where complete failure forced you to rebuild how you think about something? Where hitting rock bottom actually created the foundation for what came next? Drop a comment below. I read all of them and I'm genuinely curious about your stories. If you found this valuable, hit that like button and subscribe. We're releasing new Ray Dalio deep dives regularly, and you don't want to miss them. We're going through every major moment in his career, every principle he developed, every decision that shaped Bridgewater into what it is today. I'm your host, this is legendary investor, Ray Dalio, and I'll see you in the next one.